We've got a couple more things for the app service in particular, and one of those is API apps. And API apps are part of the whole app service ecosystem that allow us to very easily build APIs that can be consumed by mobile, by web, by anybody else that we want to consume them. And they generate things like Swagger, now Open API, metadata, so we can call them very easily. Now, because they're so similar to web apps in the way that they're built and deployed and scaled on the app service, I want to talk about what's next, and that's the API management set of tools. And API management is another service in Azure that relates very closely to these API apps that we can spin up. Now, I've got to say, I hesitate showing any of this to you. I want to keep it a secret. It looks so incredibly cool, all of the stuff that's built in the back end, that I would prefer not to share it with anybody, because we use this as demonstrations of some APIs in the back end, and when we show off the interface and how people can consume our APIs, they flip out because it's really, really cool. So here's what it takes to build API management. You need an API. And that API can be hosted in Azure, it can be hosted on premises, it can be hosted in other clouds. It just doesn't matter.
But it has to be a .NET API, right?
No, and it doesn't even have to be a .NET API. That's a great point. It can be an API from absolutely anywhere. You can write your API in PowerShell, in Ruby, in, I don't know, what was the Commodore 64 language, right? You can write them in anything. They just have to be accessible from an endpoint. Then we go and we spin up this API management layer. And the API management layer basically acts as this intermediary between your customers and your API. So when you're building an API that you want to share and publish to the world, the difficulty is you have to secure it. You have to figure out billing around it. How many times can they call your API? How often can they call it in a given period of time? What's the performance characteristics? All of these decisions have to be made and managed by you. And if you're just building an API, that's way going over the top. So what we're going to do is you take an API and build it using the API app or wherever else, and then we're going to connect it to this API management layer. And it provides this gateway to get into basically to get into your API. So everything comes through the gateway and then to your API, and you get a response back. But better than the gateway, maybe not better, but with the gateway, you get two other things. You get an API publisher portal. Now that's you. You're publishing your APIs to the world, and you get a publisher portal where you can go in and define all of these characteristics. For instance, should I have a basic plan? Should I have an advanced plan? Should I let people with a basic plan have unlimited hits against my API? Or should I throttle it to X hits per hour? Where do I want to, or per minute potentially? Those business logics go behind it, as well as defining things like what type of security model, what type of, there's a lot, and we'll have to see some of those policies when we get into a demo. But that's what I can do to manage it from my side. And I can see who's signing up for my service to use it. And where do I see that? I see it because there's another portal called the Developer Portal. And the Developer Portal is where people go, and it's the public-facing view of your portal. They drop into the Developer Portal, sign in. You could have self-service turned on, whatever you like. They sign in, register with your app, and then they get information on how to start consuming that app. And automatically generated are things like how to consume it in Ruby, how to consume it in Python, how to consume it in .NET, how to consume it in JavaScript. Some of these easy ways to consume it. And that developer portal is so beautiful and nice. And it's the thing that really, when you build an API and expose it to the world, you don't have to focus on any of that. You can just focus on the API. And when you start looking at the world that Forrester is looking at, the world that Gartner is looking at, the world that these analysts are working at, they're saying people are building excellent, small, targeted APIs that do one thing really, really well. And then we're simply combining all of these APIs to make a beautiful platform itself. Now, when we've talked to Azure, we've talked about the integration of these other pieces, like dropping in a SQL DB or dropping in some other analytics pieces. All of those can be exposed through things like these APIs. So, really excited about the API Management Toolkit, but I think the best way to see it and to see how cool it is really, Colin, to turn it over to you to take a look at a demo for one of these API management pieces.
Absolutely, Steve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a file new project, and we're going to publish up just a very basic API, and then I'll show you how we can hook it up to API Gateway or to API Management in order to manage that API effectively.
In this demo, I'm going to show you an introduction to API management. And since this is a demo about API management and not about API coding, I'm going to just start with a file new project. And from the ASP.NET Web Application template, I'll give it the name Demo API. And we'll select OK. And I'm going to select the Azure API project template. And that's going to create a project stub for me. I get a README file, which I'm just going to close. So let's open up the Solution Explorer. And there's really just a simple controller here called Values Controller. Again, this is not a demo about the code, but you can imagine we have an API that has some methods that we want to expose. And we want to be able to publish this so that application developers can consume those APIs. The other thing I wanted to show was if we open up the app start, you'll see that there's a Swagger config file. And the Swagger config tells the application how to publish metadata about the operations in this API. And there's one thing that you need to do here to open up the Swagger UI. So as I scroll down here, you'll see there's a section here right in the middle of all this commented out stuff, which has enabled Swagger UI. So this is potentially a security risk. At least it's something that you wouldn't want to expose by default. You have to opt in to enable the Swagger UI. So that's the only change I'm going to make to this project. Let's run this project so I can show you what the Swagger UI looks like. We'll just debug out of Visual Studio. And I'll just enter the URL of my web application +/Swagger, and that'll open up the Swagger UI. So the Swagger UI is a great way of discovering and testing out an API. So we'll click on Values, which is the controller that we have. And here you can see all the operations. If we expand the get operation, we can see exactly what metadata there is in the Swagger about this operation. And I'll hit try it out to actually make a call to that API. And here you can see the response body coming back value 1, value 2, as well as response headers and so on. So this is a great way of discovering and exploring the API. So now that we have an API with some metadata, we want to publish that up to Azure. So let's do that by right-clicking the project and selecting Publish. Now this is not a way I would recommend you publish your APIs or web apps or any other applications really. You want to get this into a build and release pipeline. So we'll show that in another demo. But for the purposes of this demonstration, because we're talking about API management, I'm going to publish out of Visual Studio. So we'll select Microsoft Azure App Service. And we are presented with a dialog which is going to ask us which resource group and which subscription. So I've left my subscription details. I'm going to use the Azure Demo resource group. You can see I've got some other API applications there already. But I'm going to select New within the CD Azure Demo resource group. And I'm going to just shorten this name to Demo API 2. You'll see how Azure checks if the name is available. And I'm going to choose the Azure Demo resource group. And I could create a new service plan. I'm going to leave it on a service plan that I have already. And I'll hit create. That'll go and create the app service up in Azure for me and populate the publish settings. So we'll hit publish in order to push the web app to the app service that was just created. So just after the publish, Visual Studio opens up the URL to that API service. And again, we're just going to put /Swagger into the URL to open up the Swagger page. And again, we can hit values. Let's do the get just to make sure that it's working. And here again, you can see we're getting value 1 and value 2 in the body. So we have an API that's published up to Azure. And now we want to put some API management on top of this API. So in order to manage this API using API management, I'm going to switch out to the portal. And under my more services, I'm going to search for API management. I've already created an API management service called CD Services. It's a very simple wizard to go through, and essentially you just give it a name and a region, and this gives you a gateway URL. cdservices.azureapi.net is the gateway URL to my management service. That's the URL I publish out for consumers of my APIs. Now, in order to configure the services that are managed, I'm going to go to the publisher portal. So that'll open up a new portal for me, and this is where I can manage all of the APIs in my service. So let's go and add the API that we've published. And what I'm going to do is go over to APIs and select Import API. And I will specify from URL. The specification format is Swagger. And now I need to get the Swagger URL for my service. So let's switch back to our service. And right at the top of the Swagger UI, you'll get this URL, and that is the Swagger URL for this API. If we paste that directly, you'll see we get a JSON document, and this has got all the metadata that we need to describe that service. So let's copy out the URL, and we'll paste it into the specification document URL. Now for the suffix, again, I'm going to use demo API. And you'll see at the bottom that this API will be addressed by going to cdservices.azureapi.net/demo API. And we'll click Save. So that'll import the definition in. If we go to Operations, you'll see that Management Services knows about all of the operations that are exposed because it's been able to read them out of that Swagger document. So now we have an API, we want to be able to publish this API. And the publish operation is done via something called a product. So we'll go to products, and you'll see that we've got 2 products here already, starter and unlimited. Let's add another product, and we'll call this premium. We'll give it a description for premium customers, and we'll enable require subscription. So we want consumers of this API to subscribe so that we know who has subscribed to this API or to this product, to the suite of APIs. And that'll create a new product called Premium. So let's go into the Premium product, and we'll go to Visibility. And I'm going to make this visible to developers. So developers that sign up in the developer portal will be able to see this particular product. And then we'll save those changes. Then we'll want to go over to the summary, and we'll want to add an API to this product. So I'll select from the list of APIs that are available, and in this case we want to expose the demo API, so I'll click that one and we'll click Save, and now we have demo API added to this particular product. And so you can see how products can group a number of APIs together as if they're in a single API application. So at this point we haven't actually added any real value to our API, other than the fact that we would know which subscribers have subscribed to our particular products. And this is where policies come in. So let's go over to policies, and let's specify a policy for the demo API within the premium product. And we can apply this across the whole API or specific operations if we wanted to apply policies to specific operations. And we're going to add a policy here. And this is an XML document, but you do get this nice policy statement browser on the right hand side here. So we could add authentication with BASIC if we wanted to do that. We could configure cores for these calls. We can convert JSON to XML and XML to JSON. One of the things you'll see here is we can limit rate calls per key. So if we add that in, you can see that we can limit the number of calls by a particular key, and we can set the renewal period and so on. And so we can set a number of policies here. I'm not going to go into too many details here. But the point is that there are a ton of policies that we can set here on each API and on each operation within the API. And that's going to help us more effectively manage our APIs. So we'll cancel that for now and discard any changes. We're going to just leave it with no policies enforced. So now that we've done that, let's go and publish that product. So again, we'll go to Premium and we'll make sure we publish that product so that it's now available in the developer portal. In order to open up the developer portal, I'm going to copy the link to the developer portal and I'm going to open that in a new browser because I want to authenticate with a different account. So this is the developer portal sign-in page. I've already created an account within this API management, but new users would just click sign up and they'd be able to add an account, and you can specify what sort of authentication mechanisms you allow. I'm just going to sign in with an existing account. So now that I'm signed in, I can go and browse either APIs or products, and this will show me all of the APIs and products and applications that are published via the publisher portal. So let me go to the premium product, and this product only contains a single API called Demo API, and I'm going to click subscribe in order to subscribe to that API, and we'll confirm that subscription. So now I've been confirmed and subscribed to the premium subscription plan. Now that I'm subscribed to that plan, I can actually make calls to that API. But let's go back to APIs and see if we can browse the Demo API. So if I go to Demo API, again, it's going to show me this Swagger-like page. And if I scroll down here, I'll even get examples of how to call this operation from various languages. So this is just a curl command. There's a C# command. There's a Java command, JavaScript, and so on. And so we can see how to call this API from various languages. I'd like to show you how we can import a REST API client in Visual Studio. So in order to do that, I want to save this API definition. So I'll select API definition and hit Swagger, and that's going to again open up a JSON file with Swagger, and I'm going to just copy all of that and save it into a new file. So let's go back to Visual Studio. And in Visual Studio, I'm going to add a new file. And we'll call this Demo API swagger.json. And we'll just paste that JSON. So in order to call the API, I'm just going to create a new console application. So we'll add a new project and we'll just select console application and we'll call this Demo API client. And that's going to give me just a program.cs file. Now again, this could be a call from another ASP.NET web application. This could be a call from a mobile app. This could be a call from a SPA application via JavaScript, right? The REST API doesn't require C# or Visual Studio. However, Visual Studio does make it easy to consume these APIs. So let's go and right-click the Demo API Client project, and I'm going to select Add REST API Client, and that's going to ask me to either add an Azure asset or a Swagger file. Now if I select the Azure asset and browse to my subscriptions here, you'll see that it's listing the API applications directly. Now hopefully this dialog will expand to include API management at some stage, but we don't want to call the API directly, we want to call the API through the API management interface. So for that, I'm going to select the Swagger metadata file that we've just saved. So I'll browse to that file. And we'll leave the client namespace Demo API client. And that's going to generate some code for us based on the Swagger. So if I open up the Solution Explorer, you'll see there's a folder called Demo API, and there's a number of classes in that Demo API folder that wrap away the REST calls for me so that I get a very clean abstracted surface for calling that API. So let me show you how to use that. We'll type in var API equals new Demo API. And you'll see there's various constructors here. At a minimum, we probably want to tell the API which base URL to go to. All right, so we'll select new URI, and we'll give it a URI that it can go to, which is the base for that API application. So let's create a variable called API URL. And we'll get that from the developer portal. So let me switch over back to the developer portal. And here under the request URL, we'll just grab the base of that URL. And we can paste that in as the base URL that we're going to use to reach that API. So let's make a call. So let's say var values equals API.values.get. And that'll call the values operation with a get. Now you'll see that I get a red squiggly here because the get wants an OCP API management subscription key. So we're going to need to add another string here, API key, and we'll have to pass that in to the call. So I'm going to pass in the API key. So where do I get the API key from? Well, the API key is defined on my subscription. So again, I'm going to switch back to the developer portal and I'll go to my profile. And here under my premium subscription, you'll see that I have a couple of keys. So I'm going to show my primary key, and this is the key that I'm going to use to authenticate against this API. So we'll switch back into Visual Studio and we'll paste that key. And now I'm going to be able to make that call. So I'll just splash those values onto the screen. So let me set the console application as my startup project. And we'll run it. And we should hopefully see a couple of values splashed onto the console. There we go, value 1, value 2. So let's try put in a different key. So I'm just going to delete half of that key. And this time if we try to run it, we are going to get an exception. And if we view the details for that exception, you'll see that we get a 401 access denied. And so just like that, we're able to get authentication via the API key into our APIs. We didn't need to change any code on the API itself. API management has abstracted that authentication away for us. And then we'll switch back to the publisher portal so that we can see what the calls look like. So we'll go to Analytics. And here we can see all of the calls that have been made and who's made them, what our top products are, and so on. And so let's focus on today. And here we can see that we've made a couple of calls. And so this is great because not only have we added security and the management of our API through API management, but we can also now do analytics on the calls made to our API themselves. And so we can make sure that we manage our application, make sure it scales when it needs to scale, and so on, using the analytics from the API management service. I want to show you how you can set up a Logic app. Now, Logic app allows us to create workflows that respond to different events, transform data, post out to other services. So we can stitch these workflows together that are either long running or that we want to perform logic when we receive certain events. So to create a Logic app, we'll just select new from the menu. We'll type in Logic and we'll select Logic app, and we'll select Logic app from the web and mobile category. And when we hit create, we get a very simple one-page wizard which asks us for a name, a subscription, a resource group, and a location. So I've already created a Logic app. And so here it is, and there's 2 HTTP actions and a condition. So before we get to the existing code that I have in my app or the existing actions, I'm going to select new step to show you the list of actions that we can make use of in a Logic app. And there's literally dozens of them. There's delay or delay until, HTTP, there's responses, there's XML validation, encoding, there's interacting with box, there's cognitive services. So you can see there's literally dozens of actions that we can use to stitch these workflows together. So we'll cancel that. So what I'm doing here for this rather contrived example is I'm doing a get to an API. This is an API that's behind API management, so I have to give it a subscription key in the header in order to make that call successful. I don't have any body to put in there because this is a get, and I'm specifying that I'd like this workflow to repeat this get request every 3 minutes. Now, once we've received some data from this first HTTP method, we can then pass it into the second HTTP method. And here I'm doing a post. I'm posting to a URI, which I'll get to now. And here you can see we've grabbed the body and the status code from the first request. And so we can use data that's coming in from actions down the line in this workflow. And then finally, I want to do a conditional. So I've added a condition here. And the condition is going to look if the status code from the second call is equal to 200, then I'm going to send an email. So this is the send an email action. And I'm going to, again, use the body from that request and the status code for the subject. And I'm mailing it to a particular email address. And we could continue to add more actions within this yes clause of the if statement. And you can see if no, then we just do nothing. But of course, we could have actions that occur for a no result to the condition here, which is the status code is equal to 200. So the only thing we have left to do here is to include the URI. And for this, I'm going to use request bin. So we'll go to request_b.in and we'll create a request bin. That'll give us a URL. So we will copy that URL and we'll paste it into the URI that we want to post to. So let me save that. And now that that is saved, we can go ahead and run that. And let's go over to the request bin. And we'll refresh the request bin. And here you can see we've made a post to the request bin. There's the raw body, which is the value we're getting back, as well as the response code. That was how we constructed the body. Now we'll also have received an email, since the response code for this should have been a 200. And so sure enough, there is the email I've received. The response code from the first call is in the subject line and the body is in the body of the email. And so this just gives you a very quick feeling for some of the things you can do with a Logic app to start stitching various services together into these workflows that include data transformation and so on.